I don't even know where to start. Maybe with the way his toothbrush still sits next to mine, like some small monument to the person I used to be. Or maybe with the sound of the rain tonight, the same sound that filled our kitchen the night I realized my marriage was over. It's been almost a year since everything fell apart, but I still feel it, that strange combination of guilt, longing, and disbelief that something so small could detonate a whole life. I was 32 when I met Adam. He was everything I thought stability looked like. Calm, confident, a man who planned vacations 6 months in advance and knew how to fix anything with his hands. I'd just come out of a messy breakup with someone who'd loved the idea of me more than the reality, and Adam's steadiness felt like safety. We married after 2 years, bought a small gray house with hydrangeas in front, and for a while, I thought I'd finally figured out what happiness was supposed to look like. And then there was Eli. Eli was Adam's best friend, his college roommate, the kind of person who lit up a room without meaning to. He had that easy, careless charm that made you feel like he saw straight through you, even when he was making everyone else laugh. I never thought twice about him at first. He was our friend, the guy who came over for barbecues, helped us move furniture, made jokes about how domestic life was wasted on Adam. But things like this never start as affairs. They start as conversations that last 5 minutes longer than they should, texts that turn into inside jokes, little moments that feel harmless until they're not. The night it began, Adam had fallen asleep on the couch after working late. Eli and I were in the kitchen finishing a bottle of wine. The light was dim, the kind that makes everything feel like a secret. I remember laughing about something stupid. I think it was about the fact that I'd never seen The Godfather. He said, "That's basically a crime," and I said, "Then arrest me." And it was so dumb, but when our eyes met, the air shifted. Just a few seconds, but it was enough. He didn't touch me, I didn't touch him, but something inside me cracked open. After that, I told myself I was imagining it, but I started noticing things, how he'd look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, how his messages became just a little more personal. Once, Adam and I had a fight about finances, and later that night Eli texted, "You okay?" I told him yes, and he replied, "You deserve to be happy, you know." It sounds innocent written down, but I still remember the way my chest ached when I read it, because I didn't feel happy. I felt unseen, like I'd built my life around someone else's version of what happy should be. The first time it actually happened, it didn't feel real. We were at a friend's wedding, Adam was drunk, passed out in the hotel room, and Eli and I ended up outside under the string lights. It was late, and the music was muffled, and I remember telling him I felt lost. He looked at me like he'd been waiting for me to say it. And when he kissed me, I didn't stop him. I think part of me had been waiting too. I can't describe the feeling without sounding like every cliché in the book, fireworks, butterflies, all of it. But it wasn't the physical part that broke me. It was the piece of it, the terrifying piece of being wanted again. After that, I told myself it was a one-time thing. It was. We met again the next week, and again after that. We didn't even have to say it out loud. We just fell into this rhythm, a secret world that existed in the spaces where Adam was. Every time I came home, guilt hit me like a physical force. Adam would ask about my day, and I'd lie, and he'd kiss my forehead and thank me for making dinner. And I'd think, how did I become this person? I used to believe cheating was black and white. Good people didn't do it, end of story. But when you're in it, it's not that simple. It's not about wanting to hurt someone. It's about trying to feel alive again, about trying to remember who you were before your life became routine and muted. Eli told me he loved me 2 months in. I didn't say it back, but I didn't stop him either. The truth was, I didn't know if I loved him or if I just loved who I was when I was with him. The version of me that laughed louder, spoke freely, didn't constantly edit herself for fear of upsetting someone. It lasted 6 months before everything imploded. Adam found a text, one I'd stupidly forgotten to delete. It wasn't even explicit. Just Eli saying, "Missed you today," but that was enough. The look on Adam's face when he confronted me is burned into my memory. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just looked hollow, like he'd aged 10 years in a second. And when I tried to explain, when I said I never meant to hurt him, he asked the quietest question I've ever heard. "Then why did you?" I I didn't have an answer. After he left that night, I sat on the floor for hours. The silence in the house was unbearable. I kept replaying every moment, every choice, and wondering where exactly I'd crossed the line from lonely to cruel. Eli tried to reach out, but I couldn't talk to him. The thing I thought was love started to feel like poison, because it wasn't just about desire, it was about escape. And once everything was exposed, there was nowhere left to run. In the months after, I lost everything I thought defined me. Friends took sides. My parents were disappointed. Adam moved out. Eli moved on. And I was left sitting in the ruins, trying to figure out if I was still a good person. I'm writing this now because I think about it every day, not out of regret for falling in love, but for the way I broke something I can never fix. I keep wondering if infidelity is always evil, or if sometimes it's just the symptom of a deeper wound. I don't have the answer. Maybe I never will. What I do know is this. I used to believe love was something that anchored you. Now I think it's something that exposes you. It shows you everything, the parts you hide, the things you crave, the quiet, aching truth of what it means to be human. I thought time would dull it, that heartbreak, guilt, and the hollow ache of loss would eventually blur into something tolerable. Everyone said it would. They told me to focus on myself, to let go of what I can't control, as if grief follows a schedule. It doesn't. It seeps. It lingers. It rewrites you in ways you don't see until months later when you catch your reflection in a shop window and don't quite recognize the woman staring back. After Adam left, the house became unbearable. Every corner was haunted. The indentation on his side of the bed, the coffee mug he always used, the sound of silence where his laughter used to fill the rooms. I tried to keep living in it for a while, watering the plants, folding the laundry, pretending I was just waiting for him to come home from a trip. But one night, I found myself standing in the hallway at 2 a.m, holding his old sweatshirt, sobbing into it like it could answer me. The next day, I put the house on the market. I moved into a small apartment downtown, nothing special, just 2 rooms and too much light in the mornings. It felt empty, but at least it wasn't filled with ghosts. For a while, I didn't speak to anyone except my sister. She came by with food, with gentle silences that said everything words couldn't. I told her bits and pieces, never the whole story. People always want to understand why you did something like this, but sometimes there isn't a clean reason. Sometimes it's just a slow hunger you didn't realize was eating you alive, until it consumed everything. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into it, long hours, extra projects, anything that kept me from thinking. My coworkers didn't ask much, just whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. "She looks better," one said once, "but there's still something in her eyes." She wasn't wrong. There's a kind of hollowness you carry after betrayal, not just the betrayal you've done, but the betrayal of your own ideals. Eli and I hadn't spoken since everything came out. I thought about him, though constantly at first, less as time went on. It was strange how the person who'd once felt like oxygen now made my chest tighten just thinking about him. There were nights I wanted to text him, to say something, anything, to fill the space between what we were and what we became. But I didn't. Maybe I finally understood that reaching out wasn't healing, it was reopening. Then, 6 months after the split, I saw Adam again. It was at a friend's engagement party. I almost didn't go, but I forced myself, thinking it was time to rejoin the world. He was across the room when I walked in, standing near the bar, laughing at something someone said. He looked different. Lighter somehow. When he saw me, his smile faltered for just a second before he nodded politely, like I was someone he used to know. We talked later awkwardly over cheap champagne. The kind of small talk people do when they're trying to build a bridge over a crater. He told me he was seeing someone, a woman from work. I told him I was happy for him, and I meant it. I really did. It hurt, but it also felt like a necessary truth. He'd found peace where I couldn't. After that night, something in me shifted. I stopped waiting for forgiveness, his or mine. I started to see that moving forward wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about accepting that it happened and still finding a way to live with it. Months turned into a year. I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, started therapy, took walks in the morning just to feel the world move again. My therapist asked once if I'd fallen out of love with Adam before the affair or because of it. I told her I didn't know that maybe love doesn't disappear, it just changes form, like water turning into fog. Still there, just harder to hold. Then, one day, Eli texted me. It was short, "Hope you're okay." My heart did that old, stupid flutter before the rational part of me caught up. I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought about everything, the stolen moments, the lies, the look on Adam's face. Then I typed back, "I am, I hope you are too." He didn't reply, and that was fine. It felt like closing a window that had been stuck open for too long. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently. If I'd chosen differently. If I'd told Adam the truth about my loneliness before I let it destroy us. But I've learned that what-ifs are just ghosts. They don't want closure. They want to keep you company in your guilt. These days, I'm not sure what I believe about love anymore. I used to think it was about constancy. Now I think it's about honesty, not just with another person, but with yourself. The kind of honesty that forces you to confront your ugliest truths and still choose to grow from them. A few weeks ago, I saw Adam again by chance at a bookstore. He was with his new girlfriend, a woman with soft eyes and a quiet laugh. They looked happy. He saw me, and this time he smiled. A real one. I smiled back. It didn't hurt, not the way I thought it would. When I got home that night, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the city lights. It occurred to me that maybe healing isn't about forgetting or even forgiving. Maybe it's about learning to live with the parts of yourself you once despised and realizing they don't define you forever. I'm still figuring out who I am after everything. I still make mistakes, still have nights where the silence feels too loud. But I'm learning. Learning that even broken people can build something beautiful again. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Sometimes, when I lie in bed with the window cracked open and the city hums faintly below, I catch myself tracing old stories in my mind, not because I miss them, but because I'm still trying to understand them. It's strange how memory works. You think you've moved on, that time has dulled the edges, and then a sound or a scent pulls you backward so vividly it feels like you never left. It happened one night last winter. I was walking home from work through a light snow, the kind that turns the world quiet. I passed this cafe on the corner, one I hadn't noticed before, and through the glass, I saw a couple sitting close, heads tilted together in that way people do when they're not just talking, but sharing something private. It hit me like a physical thing, the recognition of it, the memory of being in that kind of moment, so close you forget the rest of the world exists. I kept walking, but I felt the ache settle in, slow and deep. For a long time, I told myself I didn't need love again, that I'd already used up my share of it, squandered it even. But loneliness is patient. It doesn't come all at once. It seeps in through small things, making coffee for one, reaching for a hand that isn't there, remembering laughter that doesn't belong to this life anymore. I got used to being alone, but I never quite stopped feeling the space where someone else used to be. Then, out of nowhere, someone new appeared. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sparks flying or fate-driven encounters. It was just a Tuesday late, after a work event I almost skipped. His name was Daniel. He was nothing like Adam or Eli. He had this quiet steadiness about him, like he knew how to listen without needing to fix anything. We talked for hours that night about books, about the city, about how both of us were tired of pretending that we were fine when we were. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd met people before, and I'd learned how easy it was to mistake curiosity for connection. But Daniel didn't rush anything. He didn't try to fill the silence. He just existed beside it, and somehow that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. We started seeing each other casually, coffee, walks, long dinners that stretched into midnight. And for a while, I kept waiting for the familiar dread to show up. The fear that I'd ruin it, that my past would creep in and poison everything. But it didn't, not at first. The first time I told him about Adam, he just listened. No judgment, no false sympathy. When I told him about Eli, I waited for him to recoil, but he didn't. He just said, "You must have been in a lot of pain." That sentence, simple as it was, broke me, because no one had ever said it like that before. People had called it selfish, destructive, reckless, but no one had ever looked at me and seen the wound instead of the weapon. Being with him was different. There was no drama, no constant questioning of where we stood. He made space for me to breathe. I thought, maybe this is what love could look like, something steady, something that doesn't burn you alive just to keep you warm. But the truth is, some scars run deeper than you realize. There were nights when I'd wake up next to him and feel a wave of panic for no reason at all. My mind would start replaying old patterns, the secrecy, the guilt, the half-truths I used to live inside. Daniel would ask if something was wrong, and I'd tell him no, but he could see it. He always could. One evening, over dinner, he said softly, "You don't have to keep punishing yourself." I looked at him for a long time, not knowing what to say. Because maybe I did. Maybe that's what I'd been doing all along, carrying guilt like a kind of penance, afraid to let go of it because if I did, what would that make me? Someone who did terrible things and just moved on. He reached across the table, took my hand and said, "You deserve peace even if you made mistakes, especially then." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But healing isn't linear. Some days I felt light, like maybe I'd finally shed the weight. Other days, the past came back sharp and sudden. It's been almost 3 years now since everything fell apart. Adam is married. I saw the photos online, his wife radiant, his smile softer than I remember. Eli moved out of the city, started a new job somewhere up north. I don't think about them much anymore, not the way I used to. They've become part of the story, not the whole of it. Daniel and I are still together, but in a way that feels more human than romanticized. We argue sometimes. We misunderstand each other. But there's honesty here. No masks. No pretending that love erases the past. It just gives you a way to live with it differently. The other night, as we were lying in bed, he asked if I ever wished I could go back to fix things, to do it all over again. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, no, because then I wouldn't be here. And it's true. For all the pain, the shame, the loss, I'm still here. Different, maybe damaged, but still capable of love, of joy, of waking up and wanting to try again. Sometimes I still scroll through old photos, not to torture myself, but to remind myself of who I was and who I've become. The woman who used to hide behind lies is gone. The one who stands in her place has learned that love is not always about forever. Sometimes it's about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about survival. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it's about finding someone who sees every broken part of you and doesn't flinch. When I close my eyes now, I don't see the past anymore. I see the quiet glow of morning light through the curtains, the steady rhythm of a new day beginning. I see possibility, fragile, imperfect, but real. Maybe that's what healing truly is. Not a clean slate, but a life that keeps growing around the cracks. It's strange how easily life rearranges itself around the things you thought would destroy you. I used to believe that heartbreak was this singular, shattering event, one moment, one person, one end. But the truth is, it's quieter than that. It's not a collapse. It's erosion. It happens slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize you've been rebuilt into someone else entirely. I didn't notice it happening to me until much later. The guilt that used to sit like a stone in my chest became softer, rounder, something I could hold without bleeding. I stopped looking for apologies I'd never get. I stopped trying to rewrite what had already been written. There was no point anymore. Life had already turned the page. Daniel and I moved in together 2 years after we met. It wasn't romantic, not in the cinematic sense. We didn't have some grand gesture or proposal. We were just cooking dinner one night, both exhausted from work, and he said, "You basically live here anyway." I laughed, and he smiled that quiet smile of his, and just like that, I realized I wanted that kind of simplicity, the kind that doesn't demand fireworks, only presence. But even then, I still had moments where the past pressed against the edges of my happiness. Sometimes when he'd fall asleep before me, I'd stare at his profile in the dim light and think about how I'd once watched another man sleep beside me, how I'd once thought that kind of stillness meant safety. And then I'd remember how quickly it all unraveled. One night I told Daniel that. Every word of it, the fears, the flashbacks, the way I still flinched at small things I couldn't control. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened, the same way he always had. And then he said, "You're not the same person you were back then. You just haven't given yourself permission to believe it yet." That sentence stayed with me. I started writing again, not the kind of writing that tries to make sense of everything, but the kind that simply tells the truth. I opened an anonymous account online and began posting little reflections, bits of my story disguised as fiction. I didn't expect anyone to care, but people did. They commented things like, "I've been there," or "This made me cry in my car." And in a strange way, I felt less alone. Sometimes I wonder if Adam ever reads things like that, if he ever recognizes himself in someone else's confession. I doubt it. Men like him rarely look backward long enough to see the wreckage, but I don't resent him anymore. If anything, I pity him, because I've learned that the people who run from themselves are always chasing something they'll never catch. Eli reached out once about a year ago, a short message, just, "I hope you're okay." I stared at it for a long time before replying, "I am." And that was it. No anger, no longing, just peace. It felt like closing a door I didn't realize was still open. Now my life is full of small, ordinary things that used to feel impossible. Sunday mornings with coffee and music, grocery shopping with Daniel, arguing about which pasta to buy. Late night walks in the city when it rains. It's not perfect. Some days it's quiet in a way that still scares me, but it's real. And I think that's what I wanted all along, something real. Not the intensity that burns out too fast, not the chaos disguised as passion. Just two people choosing each other, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard. Last week we had dinner with friends, and one of them asked how we met. Daniel started to tell the story, laughing about how I made him wait 3 weeks before agreeing to dinner. And as I listened, I realized I hadn't thought about Adam or Eli in months. Not once. Their names didn't echo in my chest anymore. They were ghosts, but I'd stopped being haunted. When the night ended and we walked home through the city lights, Daniel slipped his hand into mine and said, "You look happy." And I was. I really was. Not the kind of happy that feels like an escape, but the kind that feels like a return to myself, to a version of me that exists beyond the hurt. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I opened my laptop and started typing again. I didn't plan it. It just happened. I wrote about how love can wound and heal in equal measure, about how sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find the peace you actually needed. I wrote about guilt and forgiveness, and how they can coexist without canceling each other out. When I finished, I hit post without rereading. The next morning, it had thousands of comments. People shared their own stories, their own heartbreaks. One woman wrote, "You just described my life. Thank you for making me feel seen." I think that's the moment I finally understood. The pain wasn't wasted. It became something else, empathy maybe, understanding. The ability to sit with someone else's sorrow and not look away. Sometimes I still dream about the past, but when I wake, I don't ache for it anymore. I just feel gratitude for what it taught me, for how it stripped me down to the truth, for how it made room for everything that came after. If you told me years ago that I'd find peace after breaking someone's heart and having mine broken too, I wouldn't have believed you. But I have. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from forgiving them and myself. Now, when I think about love, I don't see it as a promise or a prize. I see it as something living, breathing, fragile but resilient. Something that bends and changes and sometimes breaks, but still grows back softer, stronger. And maybe that's the most honest kind of love there is. A few months later, I found myself sitting at the same coffee shop where I'd once met Adam years ago, not intentionally, just by coincidence. I'd walked there on a quiet Sunday morning because Daniel was at work, and I needed space to think. The city was humming softly outside, sunlight spilling through the windows in long, warm streaks. Everything felt still, which used to scare me. Stillness once meant loneliness, but now it just meant I could breathe. I ordered my usual oat latte, extra hot, and sat in the corner with my laptop. I hadn't planned to write, but the cursor blinked at me like it was waiting. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally began to type, not knowing where it would go. The post started simply. 5 years ago, I was someone I didn't recognize anymore. I was in love with a man who was in love with someone else. And instead of leaving, I tried to love him harder, as if that would fix it. The words came faster after that, spilling out like confession, like closure disguised as narrative. I wrote about how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else's story, how infidelity isn't just about betrayal but about identity, how you start defining yourself by what was done to you. I wrote about the guilt of my own choices, how I'd hurt others in the aftermath, how grief can make you reckless. But I also wrote about healing, about the long, messy middle, the nights I cried until I was empty, the mornings I still made coffee for one. I wrote about meeting Daniel, about learning to trust again, about how forgiveness is not some grand declaration, but a quiet decision made 100 times a day. When I finished, it was late afternoon. The post stretched on longer than I'd expected, thousands of words, too long for anyone to read, I thought. But I hit submit anyway. The title was short. When you're finally ready to stop bleeding. I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The city was alive, people laughing in clusters outside bars, couples holding hands, someone playing guitar on the corner. For once, I didn't feel separate from it all. I felt part of something again, not because of anyone else, but because I'd finally stopped trying to hide. That night, I checked my phone before bed. The post had exploded. Tens of thousands of people had read it. The comments were endless: stories, confessions, thank yous. People wrote about their own heartbreaks, about the husbands who left, the wives who strayed, the lives they were rebuilding piece by piece. It wasn't chaos. It was connection. One comment stuck with me. I don't know you, but I think I just forgave someone I've been hatting for years. I cried when I read that, not because of sadness, because I understood. I'd been there. I knew how heavy that kind of release was, how it could make your whole body tremble. When Daniel came home later that night, I showed him the post. He read it quietly, then looked up and said, "That's not just your story anymore." He was right, it was. Weeks passed and the post kept circulating. People began messaging me, asking for advice, sharing things they hadn't told anyone. I didn't have answers, I never did, but I wrote back anyway, always ending the same way. You're allowed to outgrow the person you were in pain. It became a kind of mantra for me, a truth I didn't just believe, I lived it. I started hosting small writing workshops in a local bookstore. We'd sit in a circle, mostly women, each one trembling slightly as they spoke. It amazed me how universal heartbreak was, how even the most composed faces could crack when they spoke about being unseen. But what amazed me more was how resilient we all were, how even in the ruins, we still wanted to love again. One night after a session, a woman stayed behind. She looked maybe a few years older than me, her eyes tired but kind. She said quietly, "I read your post the day my husband moved out. I was going to end things for myself that night. But then I read what you wrote, that love doesn't end, it just changes shape. It saved me." I didn't know what to say. I just hugged her. And when she walked away, I sat in my car for a long time, crying into my hands. Not from sorrow, from awe. For so long, I'd believed my story was just a collection of mistakes and regrets. But maybe it had always been a map, not out of pain. But through it. Months later, Daniel proposed, not in some grand, cinematic way. We were at home, making dinner, both barefoot and laughing about how I'd burned the garlic. He handed me a small box like it was nothing and said, "I don't ever want to stop choosing you." I said yes. Not because I needed to belong to someone, but because, for the first time, I truly belonged to myself. The night before our wedding, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, and I thought about everyone who had been a part of my story: Adam, Eli, all the versions of me that had loved and lost and broken and healed. I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you," not for the pain, but for what it taught me, for leading me here. And then, softly, like a prayer, I said, "I forgive you." Not to anyone in particular, to all of it, to everything. When the sun rose, I felt something shift, a lightness, a kind of peace I'd spent half my life searching for. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like the rhythm of breathing after you've been holding it too long. If I've learned anything, it's that love isn't about possession or perfection. It's about presence. It's about choosing to stay when things are real and raw and hard, but also knowing when to walk away. And when I think about the girl I used to be, the one who thought she had to earn love by breaking herself to fit someone else's shape, I want to tell her this. You will be okay. Not because someone will save you, but because one day you'll save yourself. That's the story I carry now. Not of betrayal or loss, but of becoming. Of how everything that broke me once became the reason I learned how to build again. And maybe that's what love really is. Not what stays, but what survives.